Hello everybody, and today I'm joining you as a brand new ducking historian, a focus on military history. As today we talk to Dr Simon Peaple about where the trench warfare of the First World War came from. See you there. Hello there. Welcome back to the programme.
Thank you for having me back.
So, one of the things people noted about the First World War is that even though it became famous for its long trench warfare and relatively slow progress, at the start there seemed to be an air of it'll be over by Christmas and very quick, like the Franco-Prussian War. Why didn't World War I end by Christmas?
Well, there's a number of factors that lead to that. First of all, the Franco-Prussian War was not as quick as it might have been, and therefore one could see that there's a possibility of a longer war. And certainly if you took the American Civil War that had happened a few years earlier, then you could see what happened if you had large numbers of men on both sides. It was difficult to get a strategic breakthrough. The Franco-Prussian War didn't last any longer than it did, largely because the French command were really virtually totally inept and made all kinds of errors at each stage. And the German command was largely very competent. The German system worked well with having a staff officer attached to whichever noble was technically in charge of a particular army. And even when they didn't do as they were told, they were largely kept in order, and von Moltke supervised the whole thing very well. And so you had a very able commanding general who had well-trained staff officers attached to the nobility. And so, even when they said, oh no, I'm going to cross this river or I'm going to do this, he was able to then adapt, but benefiting from the fact the French were so poorly led, and the morale for the French was so poor as well. Numerous engagements where a larger number of French failed to defeat a group of German units, and therefore, Mars of Tours being a good example. There should have been better outcomes for the French. If there had have been, then the war would have lasted longer. 1914 is a different situation. First of all, the size of the armies was immense, which made it extremely difficult for either side to find the strategic loop hole that they were looking for. It's almost like a rugby match where you keep throwing the ball out to the winger in the belief the winger's going to go around the other side's defence. But there's like an unlimited number of players on the pitch, and therefore there's always somebody in the way. And if you look at 1914, one reason why the strategic idea that the Germans had failed was the British turned up in just the wrong place. The French had assigned them the extreme left of their army plan because they weren't sure they were coming. They called it Force W for General Wilson, who was a Francophile, and they believed that when he committed to the plan he would carry it out, but they weren't sure the British government would. So it always referred to Force W, and they said, well, we'll put him on the wing because if they don't turn up, the French armies can still follow their plan, except the Fifth Army under Lannes-Rezac would have an open flank, but at least they'd know that from the start. So the British turning up was a plus, and as it turned out, they were in just the right place to blunt the German First Army's attempt to get round the wing of the French, and then that had all manner of consequences. So that's the first reason why the strategic all over by Christmas thing didn't work. And the other explanation, of course, on the Eastern Front, the Franco-Russian alliance had required that the Russians would put 100,000 men onto the border with Germany within 28 days. And that was all fine, and East Prussia was very vulnerable. But unfortunately, the two Russian armies didn't cooperate, or else they could have made a very severe dent in the German plan, and arguably still made a dent in that their initial success did lead to one corps being sent from the west to the east. And critically, if the German High Command had kept its nerve, that army corps could have been more usefully used on the Western Front, which was going to be the critical front. So that's another reason why it didn't finish in 6 weeks. So that's the sort of essential explanation for why it then became a long and attritional war.
So there's something called a race to the sea that happens after what's sometimes called the Miracle of the Marne. Is there how would you explain that to us?
Well, the so-called race to the sea, of course, is a bit of a misnomer because they end up at the sea, but they weren't racing to it. It's just that afterwards, when you're trying to describe it, then you come up with that idea. So if you look at the situation in early September 1914, you've got what's called the Miracle of the Marne, where the British and French forces had fallen back to the Marne, the British in fact to the Orc, tributary of the Marne, and the British then advanced beyond the Orc and captured and moved beyond the Orc. The French armies turned round under new commanders largely. Quite a number, including Lanzerac from the 5th Army, were cashiered by Joffre as soon as they got back. And then that was it. That was the move up to the Marne. And they survived that, moved forward from the Marne to the Aisne. When they hit the Aisne, the Germans were able to hold the high ground at the top, and therefore now the British and French were stalled trying to take the high ground above on the Chemin Dam, above the Aisne. That we can come back to as to the origins of trench warfare. But the race to the sea was the attempt then to move to the wing of the armies. And it's called the race to the sea because that's where they end up. If you imagine that one end of the Western Front is effectively wedged on the bottom where it meets the Alps, so you can't go anywhere there. So where do you go? Well, you try and go round the flank of the enemy. So the British requested that the BEF be moved from where it was on the Chemin des Dames, be relieved by the French, and head towards Ypres and the salient, which will become the most famous bit of the British fighting in the First World War. That was an attempt to go around the flank. Basically take a homogeneous unit, the British, plonk them on the left wing again, which is where they'd originally been, but this time going forwards rather than finding themselves meeting the oncoming tide. The difficulty was that the Germans had a similar view, so they were heading round that way as well, and so when the British advanced into the area of Flanders, what they encountered was the Germans coming the other way, and so at various points in and around Ypres the two clashed, and gradually the sides settled down into where the stalemate was, which meant that the French then tried to go further to the flank, the Germans tried to do the same, and they end up at Newport on the edge of Belgium, where they run out of room and end up on the beach, so to speak, which becomes a famous action in 1917. But the the fundamental problem was everybody passed out to the wing, and both sides, with the level of mobilisation that was possible, size of their populations, both sides were effectively able to create enough reserves that the other side couldn't get through. And that's why you have a race to the sea, because everybody's trying to find an open flank, and nobody can, because there's just too many. You know, in previous centuries, someone would have run out of people and the ability to move them. Now you had trains, and you had millions of men. I mean, Germany mobilised 2 million. The British had their tiny force of 80,000, which didn't all arrive at once. But even if you look at the British, you know, they were bringing over initially 4 divisions, then a 5th, then a 6th. You know, so they were plugging the gaps. It wasn't much better than that, but nonetheless, each time they moved, they were moving round to the flank, trying to find the exposed option. And every time, each side had some men that they could shove into another extension on where they already were, and therefore you couldn't get through. And if you look at the pattern on the Western Front, what happens is that, you know, in one particular place, you know, the Germans have got to the bit of high ground first, or the French or the British had, and therefore the line goes with that bit, and then that village was or wasn't taken by a particular unit, and therefore it settled down being either inside or outside the line, and that was how it ended in December 14, in the stalemate, where everybody had got somebody in line across the whole of the European continent, from the Alps to the sea.
So, when it comes to the development of trench warfare, was this sort of like a grand plan from the high-ups, or did it happen more sort of like just spontaneously that soldiers started connecting their foxholes to protect themselves?
Well, basically the origins of the trench warfare are seen as coming in the Chemende Dam in September 1914. Basically after the advance from the Marne, the British tried to take the high ground. They crossed the Aisne, tried to take the high ground that was delineated above, and was known as the Chemende Dam because it was a dry road used by the carriages of the women of the French court. So the British, with a complete lack of imagination, went up the Chemende Dam ridge and attacked the Germans' main concentration of force. There's a lot to be said for the lack of battle planning on that occasion. And so they got wedged on the edge. They couldn't break through, and mistakenly, the 1st Brigade, having got orders to advance, had got sucked into the frontal assault being mounted by the 2nd Brigade, and it would have been much smarter way of relieving pressure on the 2nd Brigade to actually go round, manoeuvre towards the rear of the Germans, who would then have been forced to do something else than sit there on the top of the ridge. But that's unfortunate. Some elements of 3 Brigade almost broke through on the left flank, but again, just didn't quite make it. And if they had been sent earlier and in greater numbers, then again they might have forced that. So the origins of trench warfare comes when the British primarily, but the French as well, because they're next door to them on the Chemende Dam, have got up the hill, but not all the way up the hill, and the Germans, with a preponderance of heavy artillery, are on the top of the hill and able to stop them capturing the hill. So at that point, there's quite a serious issue which isn't often vocalised, and that is, why didn't somebody have the sense to say, if we can't get all the way up the hill, we need to pull right back? There's some talk of, the French wouldn't let you abandon any ground, but it was a strategic issue that should have been addressed, because it was going to lead to a lot of wastage of men. And when the British settled into the start of trench warfare on the Chemin des Dames, they were following the French in one sense, because the French had also created trenches to protect their men. But the British started to do something which was very systematised, which was about holding the ground you'd got, not thinking about strategic location. So, you know, the British trenches were below those of the Germans. They were outgunned. They were going to struggle for everything. And they were low on numbers because the casualty rate in the original BF was so high. So here they were on the Chemin des Dames, trying to hold positions that no one in a sensible exercise would have tried to hold. But there just didn't seem to be a willingness to say, over the next 6 months we'll lose all these men, maybe we'd be better to keep them. It was this sense of, you know, you've always got to be ready for the final push, which was not going to happen. So the trench warfare begins when the British start to say, do you know what, we're going to need to have a proper trench, not just a slit trench. We're going to have something that gives us somewhere to sleep, somewhere to eat, because we're going to have to stay in contact with the enemy at relatively short distances. And I mean, if you ever go to Sanctuary Wood, which is up in near Ypres, you'd see how difficult the situation was, because in the initial phase they were within hand grenade throwing distance of each other, and literally were covering the trenches in netting to try and catch hand grenades so that they would go off in the air, not in the trench. And obviously in the air was bad enough, but in the trench was even worse. So, because the force was concentrated by the trench. So it was a very, very difficult scenario. And nobody seemed to think, do you know what, we'd be better off pulling out the men, saving on the attrition that we're going to get. And it was very, very poor. That winter was cold, it was wet. And the number of men was lost was very significant. And only looks less so because they lost so many men in the opening months of the fighting through the mobile warfare. So what you start to see is people creating trenches that are appropriately sited, albeit probably in the wrong concept, that they should have gone back first, but nonetheless that they've thought about the ground, they've had a look here, they've had a look there, they said, well, that one's not so good there, so let's just sort of pull that trench back, echelon it back a little bit, so and just generally take control of the area you're in. And that's the beginning of trench warfare, and it's highlighted within a couple of weeks when the Germans land a shell in a cave that had been used as a headquarters, and the number of men killed, buried alive was tremendous. And it made it obvious that actually, whilst it might have seemed great to use a cave, if it did take a direct hit, the impact was huge. So it made people think about how you regularise the trenches. And that was the start of trench warfare.
So, just to sort of round it off, as it were, was it inevitable that the First World War would end up in a entrenched deadlock on the Western Front, do you think?
Inevitable is a strong word, but you could definitely argue that there was very little room for a outright victory. The difficulty for all of the combatants was that their plans were so well understood by the other side. So the Germans knew that the Franco-Russian treaty had a secret clause that involved the Russians attacking attacking the Germans as well as the Austrians. So they knew that. So they planned accordingly. They might make mistakes, but they weren't going to be surprised. The the espionage told them a lot about the weapons, tactics. Military chargés d'affaires were at every embassy, always sneaking around and having a look. I mean, in the case of Britain, the naval attachés were tasked with persuading people to let them visit dockyards so that they could see what the German Navy were doing. And in fact, that was critical because it was that kind of observation that revealed that the Germans were officially only laying down 3 ships in 1908, when actually they were stockpiling the parts and the equipment for 5. And that, therefore put pressure on Britain not to produce 4 but to produce 8, and accelerate the arms race. So everybody knew what was going on. There was an Austrian officer who was a homosexual who had been blackmailed. He was providing details to the Russian army. That was realised when he was found dead in his hotel room, but it nonetheless emphasised the problem. The whole Dreyfus affair turned out, obviously everybody knows that Dreyfus was innocent, but it was the mania of, oh my God, the spies, who's giving, and it was in this case pretty clear it wasn't Dreyfus, but nonetheless, well, if you were prepared to believe it, which some people refused to do early on, but the number of guns, the size of the guns in the fortresses, key tradable items for a spy. So here was somebody who had got a country panicking over spying. The British had their own worries about spies. Anyone who's read Riddle of the Sands by Erskine Childers will know, that there was this constant thing about, fear of invasion, spies lurking around, getting out plans to invade. And in fact, the book calls on people to agree with conscription. So, you had this sort of, oh look, there's a threat, and this is going on. The British came in. I think it's fairly inevitable they would have done, because the liberal imperialists controlled the key ministries. So they were going to come in to fight the Germans. That was going to even up the sides. The Germans were convinced, I believe, that they had to go to war because the odds were only going to get worse. And, if you believe the odds are only going to get worse, that doesn't mean the odds are good. So, in many ways, they had already realised that their chances of a quick victory, an outright victory, were low. And there's even simple things like, they amended the plan not to go into Holland because the Kaiser had let slip that they might go into Holland. And the Dutch government had said, you can't do that, we're a friendly country, And so they thought, oh no, we can't do that. If we alienate the Dutch, that'll be hopeless. So what did they do? They tightened the top spring, so to speak, and said, right, okay, we will go south of the Maastricht Appendix, which meant that it was a less sweeping manoeuvre. So it's not guaranteed it would have worked, but everything that happened encouraged people to go for the most narrow, the most focused situation. And, Schlieffen dies in 1912. Is that really the shame for Germany is that then von Moltke gets it. What had von Moltke done to get the top job in the army? He'd organised the King's birthday parade and done a very good job. Well, that's not war. So, you know, you've got somebody at the top of the tree that is not really up to the job. So is he going to have as skills that his uncle had to manage the nobles with their issues? No, he's not. And so it probably was, when you look at it, almost inevitable that no one would win outright quickly. But it takes a lot for people to question their own assumptions. So therefore they went to war.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Millie and Alfie for your kind cooperation during this video.
Well, thank you very much. And perhaps another time we'll talk about what it was like to get involved, be part of that trench warfare. What was the daily routine like in this very organised form of warfare?
So, thank you again to Dr Simon Peaple for joining us today, and hope you enjoy this new In the Trenches spin-off to our World War I questions series. And looking forward to seeing you again, and it was lovely having you here.